Thanks for the download. If you enjoy what we're doing and want to help spread the word, then please take a few minutes to like this episode on Spotify, iTunes or YouTube. It'd also be great if you could subscribe to our YouTube channel or even take a few minutes to write a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or on whatever platform you're listening on, as this is the best way of bringing it to new listeners. If you want to support the pod, the best way to do this is via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes, and I'm grateful for recent contributors helping to keep the production costs to the minimum. On this episode, we're discussing the incredible yet largely unknown story of courage, leadership and jungle warfare in the Second World War, and we're looking at the life of Colonel Edgar Peacock, DSO, MC and Bar, and his pivotal role with the Special Operations Executive, SOE, in Burma. My guest is Duncan Gilmour, Peacock's only grandson, who has worked with Richard Duckett, the author of a compelling new biography on Peacock called Jungle Warrior. We discuss Peacock's life, specifically his formative years in Burma as a forester, his role in World War II with the SOE in Southeast Asia, and the impact of his distinct personality on his military career. Peacock's significant contributions include his leadership of P-Force and Operation Character, which involved raising and leading a large indigenous force in Burma against the Japanese, and the challenges he faced in gaining recognition for himself and his men after the war. Duncan and Richard highlight Peacock's jungle expertise, his writing of a jungle warfare manual called The Jungle Book, and the strategic importance of SOE's operations in the often overlooked Burma campaign. Let's crack on. Duncan, Richard, great to have you on the podcast. I really appreciate you coming on. And start really with Duncan first. Can you just give us an overview, Duncan, of your ties to the book and Colonel Edgar Peacock?
Yes, certainly. Thank you. It's good to be here too. So I am Edgar Peacock's only grandson. His youngest daughter was my mother, and although I never knew him, he died about 5 years before I was born. He was this immense, towering presence in the family, and so I've grown up knowing of this person, and it's kind of been my life's work actually to press forward on the research with him and find out more about him. And then what was it, about 2015, 16, thereabouts, I was a trustee of a charity which went into Burma to look after some of the old soldiers who had fought with the British. And at that point, I bumped into Richard, and we got to know each other. And we so it happens that we live in the same town. And in 2022, I asked Richard if he would be interested in taking on the biography of my grandfather, which he said he would, and I think he's done a great job.
And Richard, obviously, as Duncan's alluded to there, you're the author. Had you done any books on the Second World War? Are you a military historian? Could you just give us a little bit of background on that?
My first book was the first full history of the Special Operations Executive in Burma, 1941 to 1945. No one had done it, so that was my original contribution to knowledge for my doctorate. It had to be turned into a book, so that was published in 2017. So researching that book, I knew quite a lot about Edgar Peacock already, but I knew all about the settings, knew all the operations, I knew the ins and outs of SOE Burma very, very well. So I guess it made sense for me to do this work, really, because so much of it and the understanding of it was already there.
And Peacock's background in Burma is highlighted as crucial to his later success. Can you just elaborate on his early life in India and Burma, his work as a forester, and how his deep knowledge of the jungle and the local people shaped him?
Yeah, he was absolutely pivotal because of the fact that he knew the jungle so well. I mean, I think it's arguable that he knew the jungle better than anybody else, because for several reasons. One is that he spent 18 years there, and the other reason is that his postings took him throughout Burma rather than just being stuck in one place for his whole career. So he knew the terrain, he knew the animals, he knew the plant life, and more importantly, perhaps, he knew the sort of the head men, the people that had influence within the country.
So he wasn't your typical, almost a stereotype of the British expat sat on the veranda with a coolie wafting a fan on him, he made an effort to get amongst the local people and understand the people he was working with.
Absolutely, and that kind of goes back to his upbringing, because you're quite right. He wasn't the archetypal British Raj at all. He was of the sort of the middle class, where they were born in India and they lived their entire lives in India, and they never really went back to England. So Peacock was of the fourth generation to be born in India, and he was orphaned at 15 when both his parents died in the cholera epidemic. And at that point, I think that is when he really made his peace in the jungle, and he began to prefer jungle life to the sort of the more modern urban society. So that's where it started, and then of course he chose a career in the forestry service, which happened to be in Burma. And he spent the next 18 years there.
And what the forestry job? What did it involve?
Well, he was in charge really of surveying the jungle and seeing what timber there was there, what the resources were for the British government. Even at that early stage, Richard's done quite a lot of work on this. The British government were interested in sustainable forestry. They didn't just want to rip the guts out of the forest and then leave it to die. So he was interested in sustaining it and taking out just as much as could be allowed. And also at the same time, he kind of became a governor of the local people on behalf of the British government. So they called him the saviour of the villages, because he was called in to adjudicate on disputes. And indeed to kill rogue elephants and man-eating tigers where they were terrorizing the villages. So that's really where his deep knowledge of the country and the peoples came from.
You're saying he's fourth generation, born abroad in the Raj, effectively. Would he have fitted in back home in the UK? I'm just interested in that juxtaposition of how he was.
Well, the answer to that is no, and we know that because he had a disastrous couple of years back in England when he retired early from the forestry service, and that's partially because he just, he was a jungle person and not a city person, and I don't think he probably liked the density of population in southern England and indeed the weather. So yeah, he tried it for a couple of years, but wearing a suit was not for him, and he disappeared off to Africa.
Just to add to that, Peacock's mother-in-law and father-in-law, they went back to Britain from South Africa, and one of the chapters in the book is entitled "An Unknown Colonial from Those Wild Places." That is a quote for how they were referred to by the British society that they were coming to join. They were a class apart. They were different. They were shunned. They were put to the side for being from the empire rather than from Britain, if you like.
So within that very class-ridden society you had in mainland UK at the time, there was obviously then class prejudice, if you like, between the United Kingdom and the colonial parts of the empire. But we'll get into him a bit more in detail as the podcast goes on. But he was a very singular character, a very determined character. And I imagine he was, correct me if I'm wrong here, probably a bit Marmite. So where did he sit in the social strata within the colonial environment that he was living and working in?
Yeah, Marmite is a word that I scribbled down. I think he probably was. I think you either took to him or you didn't. But for those that did take to him, he kind of seemed to take on a godlike reverence, and people would do anything for him. What kind of person was he? Well, I think he was formed by the fact that he'd lost both his parents, and he had to become self-sufficient. I think he was also born, I think you are born as that type of person, but he was born as an alpha male leader, and he couldn't really do anything else. So he was either on his terms or not at all. And we found later on in the Second World War that caused some tension between him and the upper staff officers. I don't know, Rich, do you want to say anything there?
Oh yeah, it's the tension later because he was single-minded, determined, and obviously being born in 1893, he was a bit old when the Second World War came around, so he'd lied about his age. But he wasn't a career soldier, so you combine that fact with his character. And he could put a few noses out of joint because he wasn't afraid to say things as he saw it. To whoever he might say it to. Yeah, he's not driven to, like the younger officers stay in the army after the war, like a lot of the younger ones.
It's interesting. I did a podcast recently with a United States Marine Corps Special Operations Forces Marine, and we talked about the characteristics of Special Operations Forces soldiers and Marines. And Edgar Peacock ticks a lot of those. Alpha male, singular, doesn't care about what he says in front of people. And it's funny that these people gravitate towards Special Operations Forces.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess they do. They don't sit comfortably in a formation where they have to
we lost
comply. Well, he was very military. I mean, he believed in discipline, but I think he wanted to be on his own terms.
Yeah. And talking about special forces, then, can you tell us a bit more about the role of SOE, Special Operations Executive, in Southeast Asia, particularly Force 136 in Burma, and how it differed from other special forces operations of the war?
Yeah. Okay. So. It doesn't get called Force 136 until March 1944, and that's generally how SOE in the Far East is known now. But that's its sort of later name. Before that, it had been called the nondescript GSI-K, and the K was in brackets, and there was a GSI-Z, for example, as well. But originally, the Far East had two missions go out there. There was the India mission, and there was it was originally called Scapula, but also Operation Puma, and ended up the name that stuck was the Oriental mission that was sent to Singapore. So you had two SOE missions sent out. The sort of vanguard went in late 1940, so they were thinking ahead. They had to be very careful, though, because we weren't at war with Japan. Obviously, we're at war with Italy and Germany, and the Foreign Office was very keen that we didn't get stuck in a war that might not happen, although, of course, they were expecting to have to fight Japan at some point, but the longer it could be delayed, the better. So they went out sort of with one hand tied behind their back, one mission to Singapore and under Valentine St. John Hillary, and their area was Southeast Asia, China, whereas the India mission was responsible for the Raj and countries to the west, such as Persia, Iran, and Afghanistan. They weren't supposed to do anything that could upset the apple cart with the Japanese, but also the colonial officials were very keen that they didn't install a sense of defeatism by recruiting locals before a war had even begun for stay-behind parties that, hang on, we're going to defeat them before it comes to that point, surely. We're a strong British Empire out here. So it was a lot of prestige and those colonial relationships were really important until the war actually started. And then with the Japanese doing so well, the Oriental mission was amalgamated into the India mission from April 1942, and the guy in charge of the India mission, Colin Mackenzie, his whole remit changed. He no longer had Afghanistan, Iran, those countries to the west of India. Under his remit, he now became responsible for everything to the east as a result of Japanese successes in 1942.
And SOE in Southeast Asia, was it like the army in that region whereby it was sort of second fiddle to the main campaign in Europe? Did they get the assets they needed, or was it a constant fight for recognition and a slice of the pie, if you like?
Well, even the army out in the Far East was bottom of the pile. And so SOE was even further down than that, because SOE hadn't covered itself in glory in the first years of its existence, particularly in the Middle East, where Slim had encountered it and Wavell had encountered it. They saw an organisation that was full of civilians that were suddenly being given rank, the same sort of status as career soldiers, and they had to work all those years for it. They were seeing resources in terms of men and material go to this organisation and weren't seeing any strategic return. So there's a certain amount of animosity towards SOE in those early years, particularly in the Middle East, and that sort of transfers with all those officers that come across to Burma from North Africa who have encountered the SOE set up in the Middle East. It's not a good relationship at first.
Well,
it's got to be proved.
Were they a bit cowboyish then at the start? Is that fair to say?
I think it depends where you look. In 1942, I argue that they actually did something very significant with very little. They had a lot of time, you could say, before the Japanese launched their attack on the 7th of December against Western interests. But as I said before, they had the one hand tied behind their back. So when they got the go-ahead to do something substantial, they didn't really have that much time to get organised. But they did manage to get fairly organised in Burma, at least relative to anywhere else. Were they cowboy? There were other people who had worked in Burma in the forestry businesses. They also were in charge of, like Captain Thompson, in charge of companies of Karen, and with the SOE levies and these hastily recruited SOE officers, they did manage to have a strategic impact on that first Burma campaign.
And the main role, am I correct in saying it, would be sabotage, stay behind operations, and intelligence gathering, and use of local forces to combat the Japanese? Are that the sort of the main four elements?
Yeah, they were organised to do stay behind parties, and they were quite crucial, in fact, in getting lots of personnel who'd been stuck behind the lines. They got them through the lines and got them out. So the early bits in 1942, February, March, there was a small mission down back into Tenasserim, back into that long tail of Burma under Patrick Maddox and a man called Captain Ottaway. And although they didn't stay there, which was what they were supposed to have done, because the Japanese had been so successful that the local Weimar had obviously, under Aung San, invaded with the Japanese. They didn't feel it was safe to stay there because they didn't have the population in that particular area on their side. But what they did do was bring out a load of British soldiers that had been left behind after the Sitang Bridge had been blown. So that was one thing that was really, really well received for what they did. The other is the Karen in the southern Shan states knew all the paths through the jungle, so they were able to guide people around and through the jungle that on paths the Japanese didn't know. And what they ended up doing in 1942 in the southern Shan states on the road that is really important to Peacock's story is they blew up the road and they blew up the bridges, and they had two big scraps, enormously outnumbered, and delayed a Japanese advance through the southern Shan states, which would hook them up towards Mandalay, and that was led by officers such as Noel Boyd and Captain Thompson. And another man, H.C. Smith. I don't know what the H stands for, but H.C. Smith, another forestry man. So they had impact on that first campaign, which showed that there was massive potential in the future.
And Duncan, Peacock was injured during the Siasan rebellion in Burma in 1930. Can you describe that incident and its potential impact on his personality?
Yeah. So this was in the early 1930s. The empire was not going through a great time. There was quite a lot of resistance against it, and in Burma, this took the form of what they call the Burma Rebellion or the Siasan Rebellion. And as far as it impacted directly onto my grandfather, he was posted to a place called Maimyo, or Pino Luin it's called now, but it was a hill station effectively. And one day, a riderless horse came galloping into town, and they set up a search party, or they called for people volunteering to go and find the rider and what had happened to him. And my grandfather was a part of that. I'm not sure if he led it or not, but he was on it. And whilst they were searching the jungle, they came across a cartload of belligerent men. Now, whether they were to do with the actual murder of the rider or not, we don't know, but they were belligerent. And in the course of interrogating them, one of them stood up in the cart and brought his da, which is a machete, down upon my grandfather's head, which went right through his pith helmet. Now, a pith helmet is only really there to protect you from the sun. It's not a battle helmet. So it went right through the pith helmet and right into his skull. He was severely wounded and not expected to live. But they got him back to the town and put him into hospital. And he survived. He wasn't expected to, but he did. And then when he came out, several things seemed to happen in quick succession. And I don't think they were all entirely to do with his injury, but no doubt it had a bearing on it. One is that the country was going through a governmental retrenchment, and so at that point, my grandfather was the game warden of Burma and had been for 3 years, so he was the big boy there. But they were abolishing that position, and I don't think he really fancied going back to doing the other work that he was doing. The other thing is that he conceived my mother. And they needed, apparently you were not allowed to educate your children in Burma at that point. So either they would have had to go back to England, or they would have had to go to India
from age 6.
From age 6. So it appears that had a bearing on what they planned to do, and also Burma was not a particularly happy place at that point, as you can understand. So they decided that they were going to move. How much of that was caused by the injury, I don't know. My feeling probably is that it played a part, but it wasn't too great. My mother always used to think that the trauma of the head wound did change my grandfather's personality. Certainly he was subject to some prolonged depressive style moods. But I wonder if it was as much that as it was the experience of losing both your parents when you were 15 and having to fend for yourself. It's hard to say, but certainly he became self-sufficient very early on.
And before joining SOE, I was delighted to find, as a former gunner myself, that your granddad served with the Royal Artillery in Ceylon. So what can you tell us about his early military service and how it led him to SOE?
Well, he joined up having lied about his age, and it seems that the first thing he did was get on a sergeant's course. So October 1940, he passed out as a sergeant. He was always going to try and get to officer training school, which he did, and he always wanted to join a decent regiment. There was some fear that the African regiments weren't going to see much more action, so he wanted a decent regiment, and he worked hard to get posting in the Royal Artillery. He joined the 54 Battery, Nyasaland Battery, Royal Artillery, and was sent to Ceylon. Sent to Ceylon from March 1942. So he's watching the news and he's seeing with horror the unfolding of the Burma campaign, and he starts saying that I need to be there. Why are they fighting in this way? I know these jungles better than anyone else. Get me back there. That's where I should be, rather than running around on Ceylon, especially after there was no invasion in the end of Ceylon, was there? There was just two big air raids. So with the Royal Artillery, they were practicing moving the guns all over the island to wherever they thought the Japanese might land. But during this time, he and a friend of his, Major Eustace Poles, who's a big feature in the book as well, they kind of proved to everyone there just how good they were in the jungle. Because while everyone's sort of struggling to acclimatise and doesn't want to go out into the jungle, Poles and Peacock are going off and finding food for the pot, coming back with whatever they found on the game trails. Then when one of their camps got the malaria rate up too high in their unit, in their battery, they were tasked to go and find somewhere where they could base themselves, that they weren't all going to get malaria. So they were already calling on his jungle knowledge. So there he is in Ceylon, between March and October 1942, telling anyone and everyone who would listen, I need to be in India. I need to get to the Burma front. I know that border area. He spent 18 years there, so he knew where he had to be, and it must have. We don't know whose ears it finally reached to make the jigsaw all fall into place, but it did, thankfully. And in October, Edgar disappeared off to India. Once he got to India, he was put on an intelligence course, and they got him lecturing in jungle warfare. And then everyone wanted a piece of him because they recognised that here was a strong character who they recognised that he could lecture, that he had a lot to lecture on, that he had this wealth, a whole career's worth of knowledge to share. SOE tried to get him before Christmas 1942, but he disappeared, and he disappeared and spent about 2 months training 7 Indian Division for January-February 1943. And then SOE finally got him on the books from March 1943. And from April 1943, he was out doing SOE things. From then, from April 43, more or less all the way through until he came out in November 1945.
And was it during his time in India that he wrote the Jungle Book, the Jungle Warfare Training Manual?
Yes. he saw the original one and said, "Well, this is nonsense."
Yes, he's quite forthright about it. And he was a great lover of Rudyard Kipling and the Jungle Book stories. And in fact, he changed the title of the Jungle Warfare Training Manual from exactly that to the Jungle Book. And his voice cries out of that book. It's obviously him that's written it to me. Not all of it, but a great deal of it, and certainly the sort of the mobile soldier in the jungle sections of it.
Because he was also a writer, you see. He'd already written a game book for Burma in the early 30s when he briefly lived back here in Britain. I say back; it was never a back for him. When he came to live in Britain for a short time. And he was publishing all sorts of articles on hunting and flora and fauna and wildlife that he knew.
Photography.
Yeah, and photography. Yeah, he's a keen photographer. There's a wealth of photographs that Duncan has, which are absolutely wonderful record of sort of 1920s and 1930s forestry business in India, in Burma. So yeah, he knew how to write. So he's written a lot of articles and a book by the time that he goes to war.
Yeah, Duncan gave me a copy of the Jungle Book to look at, and you can definitely see a very forthright character coming through there. And what's also interesting, Duncan, you asked me how relevant would it be to today, and I think there's another podcast there that we can get a chat about, because even just glancing over it, some of the tactics, techniques, and procedures wouldn't be unfamiliar to a soldier undergoing jungle warfare training today.
Well, that's pretty much what he wanted. He lobbied the army after the war to incorporate his experience into regular training. So that would be good.
Yeah, no, we'll have a look at it.
Yeah. He was really worried that the knowledge that they'd accrued and the experience that they'd had would get lost. In 1945, he said, "Look, we need to pass this on for future generations," because he said that, of course, there will be more wars, and we don't want this what we've learned to be lost. He was very keen for that to be passed on.
And it's interesting because the British Army's institutional memory is not particularly good. But I would say that one thing that hasn't been forgotten, and it might well be down to the fact that such a focus is on Special Forces selection in the jungle, but jungle warfare still seem constantly post-World War II as an excellent training ground for light infantry soldiers, if you like. And I still find it fascinating that the Special Air Service still do their main selection in the jungle. Everybody thinks it's done on the hills. The hills is just a filtering phase. The real selection, as I've talked to my friends and people I know in the regiment, the real selection is done in the jungle. So I think Edgar Peacock would have been quite happy to hear that in this day and age as well.
I think he would. I mean, I don't have a military background, so I can't speak with any authority on it. But I do know from reading the Jungle book that he truly believed that you should learn to love the jungle. That the jungle was actually your friend, not an adversary. And if you could come to that view of the jungle, then it would look after you and it would provide.
So a significant part of Edgar's early SOE work involved forming and leading P-Force. What was P-Force? Who were its members? And what were its initial objectives?
Okay, P-Force. Well, the P stands for Peacock. So there's quite a few, like Morris Force in the Chindits. That's named after the commander of the outfit. So P-Force was Peacock Force. Where I mentioned earlier that there was trust to be formed with the army, this is another reason why the work of P-Force is so crucial, because P-Force was put under the control of 20 Indian Division on the Imphal-Kohima front on the River Chindwin, and they had a couple of tasks to do there. One of which was intelligence work, of course. To get that intelligence, they needed to recruit the Bamar in that region, and they were to become part of P-Force, but also there's another side of that. The other aspect of that was that they were to find people who would be suitable agents that they could bring through the lines, train them up in the SOE bases in India, and then get them coming backwards and forwards from inside Burma proper, where there wasn't a huge amount known about what was going on in Japanese-occupied Burma. So it's about recruiting those agents and getting P-Force together. And the men who recruited to P-Force were used on patrols for intelligence, but also fighting patrols across the Kabul Valley, so this no man's land. But they also crossed the Chindwin and went behind the lines. In the SOE files, they say, well, this isn't proper SOE work, which is kind of true, because SOE work was supposed to be hundreds of miles behind the lines where no other unconventional forces were going. So we had V-Force in Burma, we had Z-Force in Burma. So V-Force was supposed to operate over the front line up to about 20 miles depth. Z-Force was supposed to have a remit to go up to sort of 60-odd miles behind the lines. So arguably, P-Force wasn't doing proper SOE work. However, with his knowledge, his language skills, and specifically having been in that area when he was in the forestry business, so much so that his wife back in southern Rhodesia, he could write letters home saying, and let Geraldine, his wife, know exactly where he was, because he'd just say, "Do you remember when we were here? That's where I am now." And so, because she used to go out with him and with the children when they were little, on his several weeks that he was out doing his forestry work. So, remember that spot where that tiger did this? I'm back there. So he knew the area well and was collecting quite a lot of significant intelligence to give back to 20 Division. And the crucial thing here is that General Gracie was really appreciative and had a good relationship with Peacock, and this trust that starts building between SOE and the army, I think is absolutely pivotal to SOE's success as the war from 1943 plays out to the Second Burma Campaign of 1945. Duncan, did you want to add about brute force?
No, I think you're absolutely right, I'm sure you'll come back to it. But it's this relationship between the regular army and Peacock Special Force, and how it worked well. And he says in some of his appreciations and his instructions that this is what we need to do, and there will be plenty of opportunity for killing, but we must not forget our primary role is to provide these guys with intelligence. And it is that which actually persuaded Slim in the end that there was a role for SOE in 1945.
Yeah, he was quite open with it at one point, didn't he? He said to his guys, "It's up to us now to prove ourselves." And there was no way he was going to do anything but prove themselves. That's who he was. We are going to succeed.
It's interesting as you mentioned Slim there, and I can't remember the quote off my top of my head, and Slim is sometimes misquoted for what I'm about to say, but he was in some regards quite sceptical of special forces, so it's interesting that Edgar Peacock won him over.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, do you want to take this, Rich? It's quite technical, but SOE was on the verge of being disbanded because Slim didn't think that he was getting money, value for his money, and it was because of a meeting between him and Lieutenant Colonel Cumming, who was in charge of SOE, that finally persuaded him to give him one more shot, and that was what actually ended up as Operation Character, which we'll come on to shortly.
Yeah. SOE has this past in the Far East where Slim had encountered them. He doesn't take a very good view of SOE. And because it's such a cloak and dagger organisation, he hasn't really got much of an idea what it's doing, to the extent that a lot of what intelligence he was getting, and Slim did moan that he wasn't getting enough intelligence, he thought it was coming from the OSS. He thought it was coming from the Americans. And this all sort of comes to a head in December 1944, when Cumming, who is the officer in charge of A Group, so SOE's basic infrastructure, there's A, B, and C Group, and within A Group you've got Burma as one of the countries, and then sort of C Group, for example, is just China. So they've got different jurisdictions. So they've got a person in charge of A, B, and C groups. But so Cumming's over that, and so Cumming has to go and put Slim straight, and finally convince him. But then even after that, there's crucial weeks through the new year, through December, January, even into February, when they're on the cusp of going on Operation Character. There's still so much disagreement and arguing within the British side. Because by this point as well, you've got ALFC, Allied Land Forces Southeast Asia, with Boy Browning in charge, and you've got some people in the Civil Affairs Service Burma who have different views on whether you should recruit the indigenous population of Burma, and you've got the governor of Burma having all this coming in his different ears and what he should do and shouldn't do, and he's got his clear ideas, having been governor of Burma. So there's actually this really quite distasteful, I think is a good way to describe it, a distasteful cauldron of ideas and what SOE should or shouldn't be doing. Mountbatten's clear on this, and in the end, Slim is convinced, and he comes round. And these ideas that SOE should just disappear and be liquidated, or that they should all be amalgamated into the OSS, that's also put out there. All these ideas about whether you can or can't recruit the indigenous population of Burma, it all finally gets resolved. But it was that bad that the recriminations lasted through the decades after the Second World War, and it's played out in responses to journal articles all the way through. So there was a lot of infighting within our own.
It's interesting.
Sorry, just to finish. Yeah, it just, and then that again is where Peacock's character is absolutely essential to making it happen.
It's interesting that Slim's a bit sceptical about an organisation, and especially with regards to Peacock, who are at one with the jungle and are living with the jungle and are comfortable with it, because that's what he was trying to get his armies to do in the Far East. Because he came aboard and it was like, we're not going to step back anymore. We're going to learn to accommodate the jungle. He concentrated on cutting malaria rates down. So you got that strange thing. There was a bit sceptical of an organisation that actually could live in the jungle and trying to do what he was trying to do on a grander scale with his armies.
Yeah, and I think that's where winning over Gracie and a load of brigade commanders like the 100 Brigade who worked very closely with P-Force, winning over those officers, and also the first MC that Edgar won, really played its part in bringing that evidence out that, hang on, SOE, you can change your opinion of it. You had a different opinion of it because of, this is the opinion you've got of it because of your experience in the Middle East. But now, look, actually, it is doing something here. And you've got your trusted generals like Gracie telling you, look, this guy's good and this organisation is doing good things for us. We are getting a good return on our investment in them.
So P-Force operated in the upper Chindwin area and cooperated closely with regular army units, as we've already alluded to. But how did irregular warfare work in tandem with conventional warfare? And what challenges did Peacock face?
One of the challenges is he wanted to get more involved, and the army was saying, no, this is our attack. You can just go and do something over there and stick to our rules, please. And he's sort of chomping at the bit, saying, no, come on, let me take a more active role. This is in the Battle of Chokchor, which is in the Kabul Valley. So he does get involved with that, and he's sent out to do some ambushes and make sure that reinforcements don't get up to have an impact on the attack on this particular village in the middle of the Kabul Valley. But that's the one big example we've got of P-Force actually working hand in hand with them in a fighting role, a disruptive role, and Peacock complaining that come on, I can do more here for you. But mostly, I think the relationship is getting the intelligence out for them on the Chindwin front.
I take it your average officer, your average soldier on the front line in Burma would have been totally unaware of SOE. Is that a correct assumption?
That's an interesting question to try and work out, because Peacock was definitely working very, very closely with some Gurkha battalions and the Northampton years as well. So those battalions in 100 Brigade, he got to know some of those guys pretty closely. So we've got their names, and we sort of trying to get and were successful. We had a really good trip to the archives and found references in those particular units, war diaries to Edgar and P-Force. So they are.
He's popping in and out. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting, because you thought they'd been completely removed and not known. It's interesting that crossover actually happened at the sharp end as well.
Yeah.
I think they had to work quite closely because, of course, he was out on these fighting patrols, and they had to know where he was, or he had to know where they were, so that they didn't get friendly fire, for instance.
Yeah. You were talking earlier on about Edgar's first MC, and that was for the rescue of Captain John Gibson leading into the Battle of Imphal. Can you share the story of this rescue and the circumstances surrounding it?
Well, I mean, it's an extraordinary story, and frankly, it's worthy of a Hollywood film in its own right. And I could probably talk all night on it, but basically, it deals with the extremes of courage, fatigue, sickness, and strong leadership. And we're very lucky because we've got the episode from 3 different angles, and together they make up a really very detailed account. We've got the military citation, and it was an immediate award, so that was written up right at the time. We've got Peacock's own account of it, which he wrote in a long letter to his wife. And then best of all, in my view, we've got this good friend of his and second in command, Major Eustace Poles, he was keeping a contemporary diary the whole time. So we've got the step by step of the rescue. How it happened was that about a week before the Japanese started their invasion, the Operation Yugo of India, Peacock was sent out on a long period patrol. They were carrying 14 days worth of rations along with their 65-pound packs and weapons. And due to a mix-up, their radios didn't function from the moment they set foot outside base. We think it was wrong frequencies or something. Anyway, they were out of comms for the entire time. And so they weren't informed when the Japanese started their attack, and they weren't informed that the British were retreating. And it was whilst they were in this situation, way up the other side of the valley, up on a 3,000-foot ridge, that one of the P-Force officers, who was a big guy called Captain John Gibson, was blown up while he was inspecting a booby trap. And so he got about 20 shrapnel wounds, which ran from his heel to his shoulder on his left-hand side of his body. And there they were. I mean, they knew that something was wrong because they could see the artillery flashes. They could see that the British were retreating, but they had no knowledge of where the front lines actually were now. And so they buried and destroyed anything they didn't need. They built a bamboo litter and they set off to try and get down off the mountains and go and recontact friendly forces. And the way they did this was they had an advance guard who were cutting a path for the litter, and then they were followed by 6 men carrying the stretcher or litter, and in the rear the rest of the group were there providing relief and guarding their rear. It was hot as hell, very little shade, precious little water, and progress was very, very slow. And they carried him down off the mountains and into the Kabul Valley. But after 3 days, they just simply couldn't they couldn't take him any further. Something had to be done. And so they had what they called a conference. So they hid Captain Gibson in an old base of theirs with enough food to last him for 4 days. And the promise that he wouldn't do anything to endanger himself. And I guess we can read between the lines there. And they set off, promising to come back. Even then, luck was against them because Eustace Poles fell over, cracked a rib and knocked himself out. And so he was only able to move in severe pain, and he felt sick and faint. And off they went, avoiding Japanese patrols. I think they ran into at least one, but they simply couldn't afford to commit to a firefight, so they had to try and withdraw and get away. And they moved on towards where they hoped the British would be. They lost about a dozen men who at some point asked if they could be, permitted to return to their families who were back over the Chindwin. And Peacock, in a great show of leadership, really, I think, he offered anybody who wanted to leave the opportunity to do so. But no one else stepped forward. And the guys that did leave, some of them were openly crying as they left the group. And on they pressed towards the sound of gunfire, which counterintuitively was a morale booster because it indicated that the friendly forces were not that far away. And after sending a recce patrol up to see what was above them, they found that they were with a Gurkha battalion who took them in, looked after them extremely well, and drove Peacock, Poles and a couple of their other lads down to divisional headquarters where they met General Gracie, and it's at this point that the general actually personally cooked them breakfast. Peacock slept throughout that day, borrowed a platoon of Gurkhas that night, and set off once again through the enemy lines back to where they had hidden Captain Gibson, really not expecting to find him alive, but he was. In fact, he was slightly recovered. And so they picked him up, turned around, and for the third time, the very same night, passed through the lines again and got him back into hospital, where he did recover, and he went on to serve, Richard will say, but I think he served in another operation in Burma and then went on into Malaya. And I believe he got his own MC at some point. And it was because of that and how Edgar Peacock, despite his own suffering from heat stroke and fatigue, was awarded the immediate MC.
Yeah, and for civilian listeners that might not know, a passage of lines for any soldier is one of the most dangerous elements of operations that you can do, because your chance of being killed by your own side are very, very good. So for him to do that a couple of times in the space of a couple of days, it's very revealing.
Yeah, well, 3 times in 36 hours, yeah.
So the book reveals SOE's involvement in the Battle of Imphal, and this was previously little known. What role did Peacock play in this critical battle?
Yeah, this was a great thing to find out, because we had no idea that SOE had been at Imphal other than with the psychological warfare units, the Indian field broadcasting units. Those units were quite different, and they had a different sort of command structure whereby they came under SEAC, but were run by SOE. They were at Imphal sort of trying to induce the Japanese to surrender by playing the music and speaking to them through loudspeakers they set up on the front line. So that was a very different role to actually fighting at the Battle of Imphal, which is what we found out that Edgar Peacock and P-Force did. So we had the dozen or so men who left for their villages to look after their loved ones, but the rest of them go straight into a defensive box near Palel. There's three ways into Imphal, 3 main roads into the Imphal plain, and so P-Force was put on the road where Palel is, one of those main roads that they needed to defend to stop the Japanese breaking out into the Imphal plain. And it was a little bits of pieces of a notebook or the diary of Eustace Poles that kind of put this together, because there was pages that have been ripped out, the messages that obviously were chits that were sent, and there's ones that have stayed in his notebook. And he says about a defensive box at Palel, and then later on he says we're all ranks of rum drinkers. So we know how many were there. We know that they were given some Gurkhas to work with. We know that they were putting all of their experimentation they'd done with explosives, the Cortex trap, the Cortex with big explosives, and also with grenades. They were setting all these booby traps out. The army was a bit worried that there would be a blue on blue, a case of friendly fire. So there's little notes sort of making clear that the Cortex grenade trap can only be triggered by someone sitting there and actually pulling and setting off the grenades. They're all linked together. So the Cortex trap, you could do 200 meters of road with grenades every sort of 10 meters, and in one flick of a switch, if you're waiting for the enemy to be in the kill zone, you can take out tens and sometimes over 100 enemy in one big boom. So they're out setting up those and pulling those and killing the Japanese that way. And they've got the defenses all around their box, but they weren't staying in their box. They were going out on aggressive patrol as well. So having got that little sense that they were there at Palel, then the next step was to say, okay, so what battalions were at Palel? Let's get hold of the war diaries, and there again, searching in the right places, in the right dates, in the right battalion war diaries, we find references to P-Force and Peacock and little things that they're up to. So they're there. They're about a company in size. We know that they're out doing fighting patrols because one of Poles' chits says, look, we need mosquito cream that doesn't smell. Because so that's a nice one. But as I've written in the book, and I'll just read from page 216 here, in the grand scheme of things, SOE's contribution to the Great Battle of Imphal may seem small, but the fact that SOE was present at all has only now been appreciated. And the march on Delhi claimed 60% of the 115,000 Japanese troops who started the offensive. It was an epic defeat made possible by many, many small actions. And a lot of those small actions, of course, are very well known, although different names for all the features around the Imphal Plain, like Craggy and even the IFBU had their own. There's a map with their bumps on it as well. So there's all these well-known and not so well-known features where these units were. But it was all these little contributions which make the whole such a stunning victory for Slim's army there at Imphal. And of course, it's after the success at Imphal and Kohima that 14 Army eventually drove all the way, or most of the way, to Rangoon.
And it could be argued that we talked about Slim's reformation of the 14th Army and the other armies there, but that was really the sort of one of the turning points, wasn't it, where the British Army out in the Far East got its confidence and Slim's magic potion, if you like, came into effect.
Absolutely, yeah. It is the turning point. And he knew that he needed to chase the comprehensively defeated Japanese back into Burma, and that he did. And there was no time to wait for the supplies, was there? There was no landing craft to at this point to do the full invasion down south, and so Operation Capital was Slim's plan to go in and bring the Japanese to battle on the Great Plain, the open area of Burma before Mandalay, on the Irrawaddy River there, and then with that success and the success at Mike Tiller, Operation Capital became Operation Extended Capital, and on they drove to Rangoon in the absence of what they needed otherwise. So it's this astonishing land campaign in a country that really wasn't. It's very different to Europe and the North African desert.
Absolutely. And Peacock, again, such an interesting character, because, again, his name pops up, and he was a key part in Operation Character. So what was Operation Character? What was his part in it, and why is it so important?
So Operation Character really is the most spectacular SOE operation of the war. It's spectacular for many reasons, really. And just a little bit of background to it. One of the officers in 1942 didn't decide to trek back to India after the main army. He stayed there. His story is fairly well known. He was then Captain Hugh Seagram. He stayed with the Karen. Efforts had been made to contact him. Two officers who had trekked out in 1942, Jimmy Nemo and Fred McCrindle, went back in, as did a load of Karen personnel, including Lieutenant Barjaw, recently a father but hadn't seen his child, in fact, never did. They went back to see if Blackbird is the code name that Seagram was given. And they went to see if Blackbird was still alive and well. There's all sorts of issues getting Operation Harlington back into Karenni between February and December 1943, but they eventually do. But during that time where SOE had what's been described as their most depressing and frustrating string of bad luck in getting an operation going, during that time, Peacock has approached to go to Karenni and start working on a plan for raising the Karen there. But they did eventually get McCrindle and Nemo in, and for about 3 months they took a WT, a wireless radio equipment for Blackbird, for Hugh Seagram as well. So for a while you had 3 SOE sets sending back excellent intelligence from deep in the guts of Burma. But as the Japanese attack on India developed in March 1944, all 3 wireless sets went silent. And the Japanese had brought up the Kempetai from Rangoon and radio direction finding equipment. and they attacked the bases of the 3 British officers. Both McCrindle and Nimmo were killed. Seagram managed to escape, but then the Japanese launched this horrible reprisals against all the villages, all the Karen people, which convinced Seagram to give himself up. The Japanese said that they wouldn't execute him, but they lied, and they executed him down in Rangoon with 7 Karen, who they also found guilty of spying. So they were killed, executed in September 1944. By which time, of course, P forces fought in the Battle of Imphal. They've been extracted in August, and they are on their way to get parachute trained and work together as special groups. This is all the P Force guys from the Chindwin form these special groups. They train together in Ceylon. They do their parachute course together. So Peacock's jumping out of airplanes into his 50s to get his wings, and then he jumps operationally finally in February. So I'm taking a long time to get there, aren't I? But that's the background to Operation Character. So Operation Character is reigniting Operation Harlington, going back to where the flame of resistance had been kept going by Seagram, McCrindle, and Nimmo, who have given their lives for the Karen in that area. So they go back. The Karen are hesitant to take up arms again because they want to know the British are back for good, because Chindits have been in and out, for example, as well. And they need to know that they're back and that they're there to stay and they're coming in enough force to protect them from anything going wrong and them losing all their loved ones and their villages getting burnt down and all of those nasty things. So Peacock argued very vocally that his 3 special groups, all his P4 should go into one drop zone. This is where he has an almighty row with the Force 136 staff officers. They try to insist that he should go on his own drop zone. He says it's no good. The pilot agrees with him when they go to drop him there, so that's lucky. So they do all actually end up, not at the same time, within a couple of days of each other, 23rd of February 1945, dropping in the same place and landing the 3 special groups, so just over between 60 and 70 men, with all these supplies for them. The Karen meet, the headmen meet, and Peacock's got some knowledge of them, and they vote and they say, yeah, we're going to take up arms again. And it swung the Karen back into taking up arms. And so Operation Character is on. And in the end, at its peak, they raised 12,000 Karen as guerrillas, led by... it works out to be about 200 officers and NCOs who are British, Bemar, Karen. There's some Chin and some Kachin officers in there as well, the Yemadars, those sorts of ranks in the Indian Army. And these 200 or so NCOs and officers are in charge of, at its peak, 12,000 men, which is the size of a British division. And that British division sat on Slim's left flank in those hills overlooking the valley, which the main road from Mandalay goes down to Rangoon. And Peacock was assigned the road that we spoke about earlier, the central zone, the road that goes from the mining town of Morchi down to Toungoo. Now, Toungoo sits in that valley that goes all the way down to Rangoon. And his task is to stop the retreating Japanese, get to Toungoo, and putting the stopper in the bottle, blocking that valley so that extended capital doesn't make it to Rangoon. And they don't make it to Rangoon. They don't make it to Toungoo, the Japanese, because Peacock and his code name for his area of Operation Character was Otter. They all have animal names. His Otter group played merry hell with the Japanese 15th Division and later the 56th Division on the Toungoo-Morchi Road. If they had not prevented getting them through, the Japanese would have got to Toungoo 6 days ahead of the British, who are driving hard. Those armoured units are driving hard, hell for leather down that road. They've got to get to Rangoon before the monsoon comes and stops all the supplies. They'd have been there 6 days in advance. They'd have regrouped. They'd have blocked that valley, and 14 Army wouldn't have made it down. Well, they didn't quite make it into Rangoon without Operation Dracula. But what they did do is force the Japanese out of Rangoon, allowing Dracula to go in with the help of SOE. This is not often brought up, but SOE is quite instrumental in helping Operation Dracula, the seaborne and airborne invasion part of southern Burma, to take Rangoon. So this is where SOE and Peacock in particular play a part of immense strategic value to the entire Second Burma campaign. This is special forces having strategic effect and doing what special forces, well, everyone dreams special forces can do. They are put in to do something extraordinary, to contribute to the campaign, and it exceeded absolutely everybody's expectations, except perhaps Edgar Peacock himself. He knew what he could do. He was confident the whole way through. Just get me in there. I can train these guys, and I'll get you some results. And he damn well did.
That raising of those 12,000 Karen people, that's got to be one of the biggest indigenous forces raised in the Second World War, if not the biggest. Have you any idea?
Yeah, it is. It's the biggest. As far as we know, that is absolutely the biggest anywhere of the Second World War.
And the Karen people today, do they remember their part in the victory against the Japanese?
Absolutely. They are immensely proud. They still got, Duncan's been and seen it in the villages himself, because he's had the pleasure of going up into Loikor and the Karenni Hills, and they've got they're proudly displaying things on the wall, plaques on the wall that they fought with Spider Group, they called it, of Force 136. They've kept letters, which I've had sent to me copies of. This is to certify that SAW no, and it's signed by Edgar Peacock. Displayed gallantry and the utmost devotion to duty on Operation Character, Otter area. They were given shotguns because that was a coveted thing to have, and quite cheap for the British to give as a recognition of their services. So I think there's still some shotguns of that vintage kicking around in the Karen Hills.
And we would go into some villages, and they would disappear off and come back with their medals or commendations, and those things had been buried for about 60 years because they implicated them in being British supporters, and of course the military junta were still fighting in the Second World War, so they were terrified of that being discovered. But as soon as we showed up, they wanted to show it to us. They still do love the British, and they're tremendously loyal and generous to us.
And I suspect I might already know the answer to this, but at Peacock's level, and they obviously got campaign medals, but did the British government ever acknowledge them in a greater aspect than that? No, there we go, yeah. I suspected that would sadly be the case.
At our gathering on Saturday, the son of Richie Gardner was in charge of Burma Country Section. He said it's just this massive cover-up. He talked about how his father tried to write up what had happened in the Burma campaign with SOE, and he was closed down by the government.
Yeah, it's just...
they didn't want to rock the boat. The post-colonial politics, the decolonisation of Burma, the British government washed their hands, and that was felt very keenly at the time. The bit of Leslie Glass's book, The Changing of the Kings, that always sticks with me is that he's walking down the road in London and he says, I've got Burma veterans coming up to me with tears in their eyes saying, what the hell are we doing not supporting the Karen? You know, they made real fast friends, all these guys that served in the Karen Hills with Operation Character. I've got letters going through the 50s and 60s and 70s where they're writing to each other through Thailand. My dear Major, we miss you so much, even though the war's 20 years ago. We haven't forgotten you. Please do something for us. We need your help. We're living in such difficult circumstances. So the bonds, the comradeship that were formed from Operation Character. So it was February to November behind the lines, 12,000 of them. the bonds that were formed stayed with a lot of those officers for the rest of their lives, well into the 80s and 90s. And even sort of more recently with the filming of Forgotten Allies by Grammar Productions, it's really quite moving. They meet one veteran and he starts singing the national anthem.
Wow. Yeah, we're so bad at that type of thing, but I was not surprised by your answer. But the results of character were remarkable, with the SOE groups accounting for a high number of Japanese casualties. What factors contribute to this extraordinary success? And can you give listeners an idea of the number of Japanese casualties? Because it is remarkable.
Well, yes. I mean, Burma is a country which is composed of lots of different tribes. It's basically a north-south country with valleys and rivers and mountains, and each sort of group has its own tribe. And the Karen were just one of many. They seem to have had a particular affinity to the British and particularly loyal. But that's not to denigrate any of the others. But they were experts in their own terrain, so they knew the jungle and they knew how to operate in it, and no one could match them. And on top of that, they were extremely brave and courageous. So with a little bit of training from people such as Peacock and his officers, that they became extraordinarily good jungle fighters. And Peacock used to say that the greatest difficulty he had was to stop them from attacking too early. I mean, he preferred to wait hidden until almost within bayoneting distance, and then they would rise up. And the Japanese called them the foe with the fearless eyes, because they were just so good and so fearless. For instance, I mean, Peacock gives an example in his post-war report where one of the Karen hillmen had been shot through the jaw, the lung, and the hand, and he'd been left for dead. But during that night, he climbed over 2,000 feet and travelled 3 miles to reach a point section.
Wow!
And eventually recovered. So, as Peacock says, these hillmen are very hard to kill. In terms of numbers, it's absolutely fantastical. It's incredible to just think about it, and it's fairly gruesome, of course. But then I guess war is. But all in all, operation. Well, let's just back up just one second. They were very conservative in their accounting, so unless they absolutely knew, they would not count a casualty. If somebody was wounded and disappeared into the jungle to die, which happened on many occasions, they weren't counted. If they blew up a troop truck, they had maximum numbers of people in that troop truck that they would count. So on that conservative estimate, they accounted for 11,874 Japanese, whilst at the same time losing only 22 of their own.
That is extraordinary.
That gives you an incredible ratio of 539 to 1. And at one point, this has been acknowledged by the army, or was acknowledged by the army, but at one point, Operation Character was killing more enemy than the entire 14th Army.
That was June 1945 that acknowledgement went through.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary casualty figures there.
Yeah. And just as an aside, whilst the Chindits went through the jungle and lost more men to sickness and disease than to the enemy, whilst Character did have isolated incidents of dysentery, for instance, and malaria you can't get away from, they didn't lose anybody, as far as I'm aware, to sickness or disease. They all recovered and they all carried on fighting. So it was that knowledge of how to live in the jungle which was absolutely crucial.
And that's, again, for civilian listeners who might not know, a lot of campaigns in northwestern Europe, you got a lot of casualties from disease and illness, and in the jungle that's magnified to the nth degree. So that is quite remarkable that those people, and the Karen people and the British people working with them, never suffered hardly any casualties due to illness or disease.
Yeah, that's not to say they didn't get ill, though. I mean, when they were pulled out from Imphal, they were put in this new rest camp called Camp Tweed. and no one had bothered to look at the splenetic rate there. And so they pull out all these jungly types. That's what they refer to them as. They tell Peacock, go and recruit the jungly types on the Chinduin River for your P-Force. So you've got these jungly types. You've got Peacock, who's done 18 years in this. They put them in Camp Tweed, and they all get sick with malaria. And he says, what the bloody hell do you think you're doing putting us here? So that was the end of Camp Tweed.
So there you go. She just left them to their own devices.
But a load of them were doing their parachute, going in their wings, sick with malaria.
But operating deep behind enemy lines presents immense challenges, including supply issues. And the Japanese army learned this to their cost as well, because they were very much a locust army that relied on capturing stores and ammunition from their opposing forces. So how did the character teams cope with these difficulties, and what insights do Peacock's reports provide?
Yeah, there's a number of facets to this, really, and we really need to pay attention to the RAF here. But also another facet is, the Japanese are retreating and they are ravishing the lands, taking whatever they can, and when you've got 12,000 men under in this operation, you've got to feed everyone you recruit. So, if anything, recruiting people was kind of held up by not having the supplies they needed, and not just food but weapons as well. But let's go back to the RAF. The reports are absolutely unanimous in singing the highest of praises for the RAF. Those guys in the Dakotas, those guys in the Liberators, but also the smaller planes. Let's not forget, there's the work of the Lysander, the Lizzies of 357 Squadron, and also Spitfires are going in. There's after the army took Rangoon, there's stories of these smaller planes, the Spitfires and the Lysanders, coming in because some of the character teams were under so much pressure. They are free dropping ammunition, low flying in these smaller aircraft, and that ammunition is going straight down to the ground and into the magazine of their weapons for them fighting for their lives on the ground in June and July. So after Rangoon's been taken, so that I think that gives quite an acute sense of how difficult it was to get the supplies. But you add to this, because the Japanese were ravishing the lands, they had to deal with refugees. There's photographs that they took of the refugees. And so the 19th Division that stayed at Tongu as extended capital drove down, they were knackered. They've been fighting since the Battle of Imphal. They're tired out. They don't make much effort to come up the Tongu to Morchi Road, much to SOE's disdain. They say, come on, link up with us. And they don't until after the surrender in August actually get up anywhere near them. They're slowly creeping up the milestones. So there's no supplies coming through that way. So they've got to take these refugees through the back paths that they know and try and deliver all these refugees, which they do successfully. About 800 of them, I think, in the end, because they just simply can't feed them. At one point, they are thinking, look, we're going to have to come out ourselves because we've got 2 days' worth of food left. There's other points where they're down to the ammunition's almost run out. As I say, you've got the smaller planes that can come down beneath the cloud, dropping this ammunition that's going straight into the magazines to shoot at the Japanese as they're fighting for their lives. When the Japanese have a concerted effort at raising these character teams after they realise that the 19th Division and the rest of 14 Army are sitting in Rangoon and not doing very much. And that's how you get that report in June that SOE is killing more Japanese than the Army is. In terms of the bigger aeroplanes, Peacock's headquarters is at 7,500 feet. It's now into May, June, July. You're in monsoon season. Some of the planes taking off from Jessore in India, they're flying down the coast of Arakan, preparing to sort of go east, and they're just seeing these huge banks of cloud, and they're just saying, sod that. They're not flying into it. If they do have the conditions to fly in, they'll often get to Peacock's HQ area, Sasiso, and it's covered in cloud and they can't see it. So if you look in the reports of the squadron diaries, they're looking for gaps in the cloud. They're circling, and there's no gaps appearing. So they're going off to another character drop zone. Maybe they're not expected there, but they're thinking it's just best that we get something down on the ground to these guys. And then in some circumstances, it says in the diaries of the squadrons, they've circled around so long, they've gone to the extremities of their fuel limit. They're not making it back to Jessore. They're having to put down on other airfields to refuel to get back to base because they've done their absolute utmost to try and get those supplies to those character teams. So if they see even just a glimmer of a gap in the cloud in Sasiso, these DACs and these libs are ducking down into it and dropping their supplies, if they can do so, as close as damn it as they can onto the drop zone before hoping that they're going to make it back. And in fact, the RAF aircrew lose more men than SOE on the ground in their supply operations.
It shows you the limits of the flying they were pushing.
They did extraordinary things, and I feel really strongly here that the RAF, I give them a big shout out every time I can, because those guys on the ground absolutely depended upon them.
And that's pretty much fair to say for the 14th Army as a whole, though, wasn't it? Around some of the key battles that the RAF played a blinder there as well. And I hate to say that as an army person, it stings me. So we've already touched on Edgar's personality, and in the book he's described as iron-willed and difficult, but hugely courageous, and we can see that already from the accounts that we've had from both of you guys. But what I'm interested in is how this character influences his command style and his relationships with subordinates and superiors. And he also had some very critical views of staff officers too.
Yeah, he did, and that came back to bite him later on. Well, as we said earlier on, he was a bit of a Marmite character, and he was perfectly sociable and capable, but he was equally comfortable just being in his own company for long periods of time. But as a natural leader, he needed things to be done his way, and he despised weakness, absolutely despised it in himself and in others. So he was very intolerant of falling standards. And for instance, if he felt ill, he wouldn't go to bed. He would go and climb a mountain and try and walk it off. So he demanded complete discipline and adherence to his orders from his subordinates, and those that sort of bought into it absolutely adored him, and those that didn't. And I think he took on the commando style, certainly in the Upper Chinduin. If somebody wasn't making the grade, he would just return them to unit. He didn't have time to go through the whole process. They were just gone. And having said that, in return, he cared deeply for his men's welfare, and he wasn't at all frightened of going into battle on their behalf. And we saw this at the end of the war when they didn't get the recognition they needed. And also, in my Richard mentioned it earlier on, but I've seen it as well. When you go into the villages in the hills, and they've still got them, and you still see the character references he wrote for the men for when they return to civilian life. And he talks in glowing terms of what they've done. So, I mean, he held them in the greatest regard, and I think those that cared for him held him in the greatest regard as well.
I think he's the classic leading by example officer as well, by the sounds of it. He would never have asked MD to do something he wasn't prepared to do himself.
Absolutely right.
Absolutely not. And in fact, that's mentioned quite strongly in the diary entries with regard to the rescue of Captain Gibson, that what he was doing. And I think Pole says it's a classic example, isn't this right, Richard? Classic example of the mind driving a sick body.
Yes. Yeah. Poles is full of praise for him. You can tell that Eustace is a bit sort of, I've broken my rib. I can't take part in this. I really want to, but I can't.
Yeah.
And Edgar, suffering from heat stroke as he was at the time, and in a really poorly way himself. Eustace is full of praise for his friend and brother officer there, going to do that. do that rescue. He says, it's the will of the mind over the physicality of the body.
And we forget he wasn't a young man. That's the other remarkable thing. He was not like a 25-year-old at this point.
No, he's in his 50s. But
So, I mean, Duncan, you just mentioned it there. You said that after the war, he faced a real battle for recognition for the men under his command. Can you explain why this was such a struggle and what the outcome was?
I think so. I don't know if Richard's better placed to do it, but I think a lot of it was directly as a result of some of the way that he'd interacted with Calcutta staff during the Operation Character. And, he had demanded and shouted and screamed for more equipment or more food or more clothing. And I think perhaps sometimes the way that he put it was not well received. And there's an example where somebody was overheard to say, this is in Calcutta, somebody was overheard to say, "We fixed it so that Otter get nothing out of this." And indeed, that's pretty much how it turned out. So at the end of the war, all the other area commanders got DSOs, but Peacock got mentioned in dispatches, which is almost a kick in the teeth because he hadn't been forgotten. They'd thought about what they were going to give him, and it wasn't a DSO. And almost all of his recommendations for the men under his command were battered away and weren't given. And I think that's him and Poles together were the scourge of Calcutta. Rightly or wrongly, that's how it was. So there was a struggle after the war, and it was joined by the other area commanders. They all got together and said, particularly for Peacock, how can we get these DSOs, and he doesn't, because he's the guy that planned this whole operation and took the central area, which was arguably the most important. And they all went into bat. Peacock, of course, went back to Rhodesia, so he was never in London. But those commanders who went back to London went in and lobbied the War Office relentlessly until the wrong was righted. But Rich might have some more sort of technical details on that.
Yeah, some of the letters that have survived in your family archives really illuminate this battle with the War Office going on through 1948. And really show, the correspondence shows how, as Duncan just said, all these other officers really were quite disgusted with what happened. Part of where it comes from that we haven't discussed, though, is what happened with Eustace Poles's special group. He was supposed to have his own area, codenamed Ferret, and he trekked up towards Sasiso with Otter Group, left Otter Group to pass over to the northern side of the Morchie Road. They haven't had the supplies that they needed because, for one reason or another, they didn't receive it. They say they turned up in their area in rags because of the degradation of the jungle and the harsh journey that they've made is sort of over 80 miles. Yes, as the crow flies. And when they get there, they're told, well, you've got to go back to Peacock. You're coming under his command as Otter. And meanwhile, over in Ceylon, Lieutenant Colonel John Cromarty Tulloch, who was also in his 50s, so he's nicknamed Pop, he's briefed as Ferret area. And then he's all confused because all of a sudden he's no longer Ferret and he's going somewhere slightly different, and he's now renamed Walrus. And Poles, being the magnanimous guy he is, who goes and helps out Walrus, who have a disastrous drop with men breaking their feet and all sorts of injuries on their drop zone, but he helps sort them out. And then he's got to go all the way back and having given his command that he's been working for all his time in India with P-Force and everything, he's had to give it up on someone's someone's whim back in Calcutta. So Poles is absolutely spitting blood. He's furious. And he makes, he doesn't try and hide it anywhere. Like Peacock, he tells them what for. What bloody hell do you think you're doing to me? And so we end up with this situation, with this comment is apparently overheard, where they're saying that we've fixed it so that Otter get nothing, and that's because Peacock and Poles have been so angry with what's happened.
It's I've never really heard somebody being. I think it's quite hard to come up with an adjective. I don't know if snubbed or deliberately excluded, but it's also revealing that he's respected by his peers, and I think that says a lot.
Certainly,
yeah.
One for Duncan, really. Edgar died at a young age of 62 in 1955. What killed him, and how was he remembered by the family when you were growing up?
Well, I mean, his death certificate states that he died of uremia, which is kidney disease, and hypertension. And he had certainly been going to see a doctor for some time before his death, so it probably was kidney failure. Now, I've spoken to a friend of mine who's a doctor, and she suggests that the head wound all the way back from 1932 could most certainly have helped with the hypertension. Not to mention the stresses and strains of the war and the post-war years. But alongside of that, of course, he came back from the war, malnourished and worn out, and in his 50s, 52 or 53, and straight into trying to rebuild a farm, and also straight into a drought. In 1947, they had a drought which just about killed all his crops. So he had severe financial problems as well. And on top of all that, he'd built a dam, which then burst, and he had to go and build it all again. So, he wasn't a man to shy away from challenge, but I think, the layer upon layer upon layer of stresses and strains which he'd picked up from the war onwards, they all built up, I think, and he eventually just began to lose weight, and then as you say, he died in 1955, age 62.
It's probably not an unfair comparison. The way he died and his service, and maybe the contribution of his service to his death, remind me a little bit of Freddie Spencer Chapman. I mean, Freddie Spencer Chapman committed suicide, but I think, did he also have trouble settling into civilian life post-war? Because Chapman certainly did. How did you go from leading men behind the lines to civilian society?
Well, just in terms of Peacock, he didn't have any ambition to continue in the military. I think he was quite happy to go back and be a farmer, but he certainly liked his rank, and he liked being a big wheel. My mother does say she was 13 when he came back from war, and he'd always wanted a son, and he got 2 daughters. So she was kind of always trying to be the son he never had, and he put her through basic training. So she was crawling under the barbed wire and, running forward, shooting and running again. He would talk about, marching behind him along a path, and his rifle would be over his shoulder, and every time he took a step, it would hit her on the head. I don't think he had trouble insofar as he was hankering back to a military career, but certainly alongside of so many other returning soldiers, I think he found it difficult to reintegrate into a civilian life where they just didn't know what he'd been through.
Yeah, and given his significant contributions and decorations, Richard, why do you think Edgar Peacock's story has remained relatively unknown until now?
I've got 4 things to say there. 3 of them we've kind of covered already. So first of all, there's the security around SOE, and the time it's taken for declassification of files and things. Related to that is that files that have been destroyed and weeded out over the years. There was a fire, and SIS didn't really like SOE, so SIS chucked a load of stuff out. So, for example, we don't have any NCO files. We've only got the officer files left. There's gaps in the files there. So certainly their own security, and then the sort of British security of records afterwards. We've mentioned the fights with Calcutta. That's the second thing. But it's interesting there, isn't it, that even though they had the fights with those staff officers, the son of the guy in charge of the Burma country section staff officers say that there's been a massive cover-up, as we said earlier. And, well, lastly then, the third thing, that we've spoken about briefly was decolonisation. So the decolonisation of Burma, and how we just needed to leave Burma alone, and that whole withdrawal from empire through those years, which probably leaves a bit of space, I suppose, for my fourth point, and that is the obsession with Europe. Most things SOE are Eurocentric. We've got the first official history was SOE in France. We've got SOE in Scandinavia. We've got such an astonishing story here. It's lucky for me nobody took it, because I got to do the book on SOE in Burma, so I'm well pleased about that. But surely someone should have done it before I did. And I sat on this project for 7 years before I started going for it in earnest, and all that time I was checking the new doctoral thesis that had been started and going every year until I was ready to be in a position to start my doctorate and get really into this. So there's this obsession with Europe, which is also kind of linked to what happened to the end of the war. Louis Allen's book, the title of that, The Forgotten War, and we got the army, the 14th Army, that call themselves the Forgotten Army. So you've got a forgotten war with a forgotten army, and so what we have here is even more forgotten special forces, I guess. And
yeah, no, I have to confess my own ignorance here, that I've been an avid reader of military history for 50 years, and I think I only discovered about SOE in the Far East in the last 5. So I'll put my hand up to that shameful admission as well. But I'm slowly but surely writing that wrong. So my final question then to both of you really is, and you can have a bun fight who goes first. What do you hope readers will take away from Jungle Warrior, and where can listeners get a copy?
Go on, Duncan.
Well, I mean, obviously, from my own personal perspective, I would like my grandfather to finally sort of emerge out of this undergrowth where he's been lost for 80 years now, and to finally get the recognition for his contribution. But also, we've been talking about the war because that we're in that kind of podcast, but actually it's a book which satisfied on several different levels. Because what Richard's done very cleverly, I think, is that as he goes through Edgar's life, which of course starts in 1893, he takes what happens to Edgar and he puts it into a historical perspective of what's going on in the world at the time. And that's really excellent, I think, coming from somebody who's not a particular historian myself. And he's constructed a really remarkable account of what it was like to grow up in the British Empire of the early 20th century. And the other thing, I think Richard and I we started off a bit tentatively, and as the book progressed, it became more and more clear that what Edgar had done was something quite out of the ordinary. And actually, we had the book launch yesterday, which was a fantastic event at the Victory Services Club with lots and lots of old relatives. But we had Dr. Rob Lyman, who was one of our speakers, and Rob is a prolific historian and very well respected. And he said, really, thanks to Richard, he said really until he'd read Richard's book, he really didn't know enough about what SOE had done. And now that he's read this fourth book of Richard's, Jungle Warrior, he said it to me before. privately, but he came out and said it publicly now, so I would like to share it. And that is, he's absolutely unequivocal that if it had not been for Operation Character, designed and led by Peacock, 14th Army would not have conquered Burma in 1945. Rangoon would not have been evacuated because they would have been held up in Tanggu. And he goes further, and it's a bit more of a leap, but, arguably he says that had Rangoon still been in Japanese hands when the atomic bombs were dropped, then the Japanese emperor may very well have been tempted to carry on fighting and not have surrendered.
Where can people get a copy then?
On any online store, Waterstones, WH Smith, any of those ones. You can get it direct from the publishers Chiselbury Publishing, which I would recommend, or I would prefer you to do. You can get it from Amazon, which I would prefer you not to do. But you can do it if you wish.
Excellent. Guys, that's us wrapping up. I'd just like to say I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and I thank you for the preview copy. Certainly, as I said before, it's filling in the huge gaps in my knowledge and actually has led me down a path to looking out some additional material, like your book on SOE in the Far East, your first book, which I'll be making my way to fill in those gaps I mentioned. That's it. So thank you for coming to the podcast, guys.
Thanks very much for having us.
Well, thank you for having us. It's been great.
Thank you.
That's it for another episode. Thanks to our guest for coming on, and to you, the podcast listener, for your continued support and suggestions. Please keep them coming, and our email and social media links are at the bottom of the show notes. You can find us on all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you download us from iTunes and like the podcast, it'd be great if you could leave us a review there or anywhere you get your podcasts from. Finally, thanks again to Nick Beale for his continuing help and offering technical support for his company ISAR, and we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.